Helpless is the latest foster care memoir from Cathy. This was released last month in August, and unfortunately, it's not good. I have read every Cathy book. I've loved pretty much all of them. In general, I have nothing but praise for them. But this one is really poor. And I will give examples for why that's the case, some of which are spoilers, so I'll save those towards the end. But unfortunately, I feel like this might be the way they're going because Cathy has now, at this point, semi-retired. She's doing some other help in the community and she's helping out a woman called Janie in this particular story. And Janie is a single parent with 3 young children, Riley, Jayden, and Lola, and she's struggling as a single parent on benefits, and Cathy visits her a few days a week to help out, and she ends up doing a little bit of respite care for Riley. So we're still getting kind of the foster carer aspect in there. But because she's no longer taking long-term placements, which is completely understandable, at some point she'd have to retire or semi-retire and spend time focusing on herself and her family, it means that it's unlikely, and I could be wrong about this, kind of hoping I am, but it means she's less likely to spend a lot of time with children with either complex behaviours or complex backgrounds that are going to give us really fascinating stories. So if this is the way things are going, I wouldn't be surprised, but I really hope I'm wrong about that. As I said, with this one, she does give some respite care and looks after Riley. And honestly, and this is factually accurate, nothing happens until the last 20% of the book. And I know it's the last 20% because finally something happened. And I won't say what that is, at least just now. I might give a spoiler warning and explain it in more detail. But when something finally happened, I was reading the ebook, and I had 20% of the book left to go. So for about 80% of this, all that happens is a dog pees on the carpet. And I'm not joking when I say the majority of this is about a puppy. And it's a little bit ridiculous. So nothing happens for 80%, and the pacing is horrendous. There is so much padding, so much fluff. I don't need to be told 20 times that the dog has done a pee on the carpet. And I don't know if it is 20 times, could be more, could be less, but it happened a lot, and everything just is so flat. There were quite a few times I got to the end of the chapter and thought, how can this be the end of the chapter? Nothing has happened. We've made no progress. We learned nothing about the characters. And I use the term characters because these are based on true stories, but obviously modified to protect the identities of the individuals. But to be honest, there's not a lot they need to be protected from here because not a lot happens. But nevertheless, it is obviously based on truth. And there was even one point where the chapter ended with the dog peeing on the carpet, or the floor. It might not have been a carpet, but peeing on the floor again. And I just thought, who thought that was a nice way to end a chapter? It's not interesting, it's not compelling, it's not gripping. Nothing happened in this chapter, and that happens pretty much throughout the entire thing. And it is slow. And then, as I said, something does happen when we have 20% of the book left. And that last 20% happens over the course of about 5 months. And I've never had such a rushed ending to any foster carer memoir ever. It's almost like there was a deadline, we got 80% through, nothing had happened, and they had to meet the deadline, so they rushed the last however many couple of chapters at the end. And if they'd brought that in much earlier, then we could have fleshed that out a lot more, and it would have been really educational, really informative. I'll talk more with a spoiler warning in a moment by what I mean about that. But there could have been so much value in that section. But unfortunately, it was just horrendous. There are some typing errors. One might suggest grammatical errors, but I do think it's more just typing errors rather than a lack of understanding about grammar. So in general, each sentence is well written for the most part, but obviously when the sentences are all put together, it's a very, very poorly constructed narrative, and there is so much repetition, so much fluff. I have never read so much about a dog peeing in my life. Helpless is not great. I will now, with a spoiler warning, go into a little bit more detail about what happens in that final 20%. I won't tell you ultimately what happens with the children, but this is, of course, a spoiler for the only interesting thing that happens in this book. So, for 80% of it, spoilers from now, 80%, Cathy looks in on the family. She occasionally looks after Riley. They go bowling several times, very repetitive. They get a dog pretty early on. The dog's called Max. It's a Staffy. I had a Staffy. That made me happy. But unfortunately, the dog just pees for about half the book. And then, 80% in, Cathy goes to visit them. The mother, Janie, is not at home, and the children are on their own. And Janie ends up coming back, and obviously the police have been called because she left the children overnight, and they're very young children, and she then has to go through a parenting assessment for the last 20% of the book. And as I said, I won't say if the assessment is successful or anything, but it spans the course of about 5 months. And there is so much value in that, in what the process is like, in what a Section 20 is. And what was also quite strange is that Janie was asking Cathy questions about what a Section 20 is, and Cathy had to do a lot of research to give her the answers, which is quite peculiar because in every book that came before this, she could just explain what a Section 20 was without any issue, because obviously for 30 years she's been dealing with it. So that was a little bit peculiar. And basically we get a lot of very condensed, rushed information about this process, about what to expect, about how serious the situation is. And that could have been so much more valuable if it had been introduced earlier, either from an educational perspective or to help people going through a similar situation, or indeed if a child who had been through the foster care system wanted to learn about what that part of it was like, because obviously very young children taken into care under a Section 20 aren't really going to understand it. That could have been so interesting. And unfortunately, they just rushed it into a couple of chapters, and it just felt very, very poorly written. One of the worst written foster care memoirs I've ever read, because it's boring for the most part, and then the good bits are very badly done. So Helpless is not a good book. The tagline, "Are Riley and his 2 little siblings in danger?" Well, no, for the most part, they aren't. And the one moment when they could have been, you just kind of rushed over it. So unfortunately, I don't know if this is the first time I'm saying this, but I don't recommend this Cathy Glass book. I don't say that often. I don't know if I've ever said it before, but it's not well written. It's not a good story. We could have had this as a condensed short, and that would have been a bit better. It still would have been quite a lacking narrative. They'd still have to move the pacing around and shift the focus, but it would have made more sense than the very boring fluff that is the bulk of this. I am concerned that they're going to go in this direction. And as I said, it is understandable if Cathy wants to go into semi-retirement, but it does mean that she's very unlikely to be dealing with interesting scenarios. So they're going to have to put a lot of work into the future stories if they're going to be anything like this. And this one is not one that I recommend. It's very, very rare that I don't recommend any foster care memoir, but Helpless is very badly written.